I'm Jeff Boer, CEO and founder of Triathlon. We do optimized training programs based on actual data from actual training and race results, rather than relying on philosophy and tradition and theory. With training for any sport, especially triathlon and endurance sports, nutrition is just a critical component. And in the same way, you hear a lot of talk about protein and hype and fads and trends about protein. Well, today I'm super excited to be able to drill down to the actual food scientists that are doing the research that all of these other people are referring to. So we're going to go directly to the source. And today we're going to be talking with three different people. Dr. Heather Leidy, she really focuses on satiety and protein's role in curbing hunger, controlling your hunger, as well as controlling your body composition, whether you're trying to lose weight or maintain an optimal race weight. And we're going to be talking with Dr. Doug Paddon-Jones as well. He really focuses on protein's role in protein synthesis and maintaining muscle mass. For athletes in general when you're training a lot, but also as you get older, masters athletes, how do you maintain that muscle mass as you age, and also when you have periods of less activity or reduced activity due to injury or in the off season, different things. So that's really critical as well. And also Dr. Mike Rosell, he really focuses on cardiovascular disease and protein's role in just a general healthy lifestyle, heart healthy living. So I'm really excited to share with you today these talks with these three experts that are out there on the forefront of research around protein and how it impacts us as endurance athletes. Enjoy.
All right, well, thanks for the chance to chat to you today. I'm Doug Paddon-Jones. I'm a professor of nutrition and metabolism at the University of Texas Medical Branch. And our research is involved in looking at muscle and strategies to hold on to muscle if you're injured, or even interventions that might help us increase muscle mass or optimize performance. Now, what I'd like to chat to you today a little bit about some of the research we're doing. And a lot of it is focused on the age span, maintaining muscle as we get older, but there's a lot of relevance for endurance sports and athletes as well. And when we really think about optimizing muscle health with a view for performance, that there's really only three ways that we can affect muscle mass and function. And that's with exercise, obviously. Nailing down a training plan is vitally important. There's anabolic therapies in a clinical sense. We're not going to mention them so much today. But really when it comes down to improving performance, optimizing muscle health, it's nutrition or quite often protein that represents the fundamental element or the keystone that has to be in place for any other intervention to be effective. Now you might have the best designed training plan imaginable. But if you really don't optimize your nutritional support, you're going to get less than optimal benefits. All right, so that's how I like to have, that's my conceptual framework for how I think about nutritional advice and complementing exercise programs with that. Now, to talk a little bit about some of the research we're doing, a lot of it will be of immediate benefit for older adults, older athletes, or athletes who are going to be inevitably injured and need some time off during the season. Now, what I'll talk about soon is these periods where you might come off the bike. You might break a collarbone, a wrist, have some bad gravel rash, for example, and you're unable to train or maybe physically inactive for a short period of time. And I think it's these relatively brief periods of time that we can concentrate the nutritional interventions to try and reduce the deconditioning that happens really quite quickly, improve recovery, and ultimately get you back training at a higher level quickly. So how do we do this? Well, let me run you through some of the research that we've been doing through the past several years. Now, a lot of the research that we've been doing is looking at our muscles, our body's ability to respond to protein. Now, some of the early research was done with these isolated amino acid drinks or whey protein, where you dissolve them and try and drink them down. super effective for promoting muscle protein synthesis, the potential for muscle growth and repair. But these amino acid drinks just taste awful, so they're not really practical regardless of how hardcore you are. What we did a few years ago was ask a real simple question. What would happen if we gave young and older adults an actual high quality protein? And in this series of studies, we took lean beef and we gave some young adults who were about 30 and older adults closer to 70, 4 ounces of lean beef. And we wanted to see if this actual high quality food could also stimulate muscle growth and repair. Now the research we do is quite sophisticated. We take muscle biopsies and lots of blood from our volunteers, but we can measure the rate at which muscle is being built, muscle protein synthesis. So when we bring these research volunteers into the laboratory, we measure muscle protein synthesis at rest, and then 4 hours following this single meal ingestion. Now 4 ounces of lean beef contains about 30 grams of protein, and that's a number we'll come back to several times. Now right away, the really encouraging result here was that we saw a 50% increase in muscle protein synthesis after this ingestion of a real food. And the takeaway point here for masters athletes was that this response was similar in the young and the older volunteers. Now that's important, and to me that suggests that aging doesn't necessarily impair our ability to take real food and use it to build and repair muscle. Okay, right. Now we did do a follow-up to this study. You know, we're in Texas, and you can't get 4 ounces of anything at a restaurant here. So we wanted to do a study that was representative of some of these larger portions that we're consuming at restaurants, but also a dose response. You know, a lot of athletes and individuals will consume more protein or need to consume more at a single meal. So we took a similar group of young and older adults, and we gave them 12 ounces of lean beef. That's 90 grams of protein. And what we found was that despite consuming 3 times as much protein in that single meal, their ability to use that protein to build and repair muscle didn't really go up at all. Now, sometimes those no difference results it's disappointing, but I think this was a really powerful message of moderation. And that suggests to me that somewhere around 30 grams of protein in a single meal is close to the maximum, or the ceiling effect, the most we can take in at a single meal and effectively use it to build and repair muscle. Now, we can talk about some of the unique demands of different populations. And the thing to remember, if you're an athlete or someone involved in different sporting activities, or you've got special demands on your body, 30 grams isn't a magic number. All right? For a lot of endurance athletes, strength athletes with really high energy demands, you need to eat more of everything. So there's absolutely no reason why 30 grams has to be the maximum that you can eat at a single meal. What we really don't know in the research is if you consumed 40, 50, 60 grams in a single meal, can you effectively use that to build and repair muscle? Can you use a smaller portion of that? Or are you just using it for extra energy? And that's a fine line that, again, we'll come back to. Unless you've got really high energy demands, you have to be very careful and efficient with the protein, carbs, and fat that you're taking in. Increasing body weight, fat is really going to be of limited benefit to almost anybody. Right. So talking about the benefits of protein, when we combined this high protein meal with a bout of exercise, this is where we start to see the beneficial effects. In this study, we actually got our volunteers, young and older again, to do just a simple bout of leg extension exercise. But I think if we had have substituted most forms of resistance exercise, and perhaps to a slightly lesser extent, an intense bout of endurance exercise, we would have seen a similar type of response. In this study, we saw a further 50% increase in our participants' ability to use that protein combined with exercise to build muscle. And again, the most encouraging aspect for masters athletes was that the young and the older adults had the same response to both the protein and the exercise. So that's encouraging, to have the ability to respond to these two prime stimuli as we age. All right, so let's turn the conversation to groups, sort of a more clinical population, or groups that might be trying to lose weight or have some sort of eating restriction. Most researchers would agree that if you give almost anybody a moderate to large amount of protein in a single meal, 25, 30 plus grams, they'll do well. If you've got a population that, say, consumes 15 grams at a single meal, what happens? Well, for young adults, it's a proportional drop-off. So if you give a young adult about 15 grams of protein, their ability to use that slightly smaller amount drops by about half, proportional. Here's the bigger problem for older adults. If you give an older adult a suboptimal amount of protein, 10 to 15 grams, their ability to use that smaller amount drops off precipitously. Now that's a problem. And we're hearing a lot about terms like anabolic resistance. You just can't respond as you age to smaller amounts of protein. And what I'd encourage everyone to do when this is a practical science, so put it in a practical context. So on this slide you can see a couple of common breakfast type foods. And I think really until the last 5 or 6 years, if you had have approached any coach, dietitian and said, look, this morning I had some fruit and an egg and a glass of milk, they might have said, fantastic, you've got 2 high quality protein choices, well done. But when you start to look at the gram amount of protein that you've consumed, an egg might be 6 grams of protein, a glass of milk might be 8, so maybe you've got 14, 15 grams in that meal. For a young adult, that's not so bad, that's marginal. For an older adult, that 14, 15 grams falls quite a way below the optimum or the maximum potential for building muscle. Now that's problematic. Now those series of acute muscle metabolism studies are really useful for giving us direction where to go with longer follow-up studies. And it led us to really think about or question, are we optimizing our diets and the amount of protein that we're consuming? And if you look at large data sets, population level data, or even just think about your own diets, think about when you consume protein. Now for the average Western adult, average American, we consume about 90 grams of protein per day. Now in terms of the RDA for protein, which is 0.8 grams per kilogram of your body weight, the average American's consuming about 50% more, 1.2 grams per kilogram. But the problem is, we're not really doing it in a thoughtful, evenly distributed manner. Now think about your own diets, most of us. Breakfast, for a lot of us, tends to be a really heavily carbohydrate-dominated meal. We tend habitually to go towards the breakfast cereals, the bread products, bagels, etc. Lunch can be really variable, but for a lot of us, the evening meal, dinner, is where we consume the bulk of our protein and energy, calories. Now based on those studies we just talked about, where 30 grams seems to be about the most we can effectively use for building and repairing muscle, that really led us to think about ways to maybe redistribute or change our daily intakes to optimize intake and hopefully performance. So here's just a couple of figures, cartoons highlighting the typical distribution for someone who has about 90 grams of protein available to them. And the big caveat here is for most people, when we're talking about protein and supplementations, this is not about just bluntly throwing extra protein at people's diets. That's kind of an unsophisticated, almost dumb approach for a lot of us. What I think is a more thoughtful and eventually beneficial practice is to take some of the protein that we may be over-consuming at the evening meal and apply it to breakfast. Breakfast is really the low-hanging fruit. So on this cartoon here, you can see an example, someone who's got 90 grams of protein available. They're taking most of it in at the evening meal. Maybe it's 65 grams of protein, and that isn't a massive amount of beef, fish, or chicken, whatever your choice may be. But if your muscle is really only able to use a fraction of that, maybe close to 30 grams, you might take in 90 grams, but what does the muscle actually see? It's not a linear mathematical equation, but I suspect it's quite a bit less. So here's the step that I think is the next logical approach. Same total amount of protein, we're not adding extra to someone's diet, we're just changing how it's apportioned. And the goal here is to get multiple periods throughout the day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner as a framework to start, where you're getting closer to optimally stimulating the potential for muscle growth and repair. All right. And we'd hope that over time, years, that would translate into the preservation of muscle mass and function, and really set up this structure or framework that can optimize not only long-term health, but potentially training benefits and adaptations. Now, throwing exercise activity into this equation, it's quite often useful to talk about the extreme. So if you're a breakfast skipper, you don't eat breakfast at all, or you're a tea and toaster, okay, and that's when you exercise early in the morning. Now, I've shown you before that if you have protein plus exercise, you get that synergistic effect. Okay. Now, if you skip breakfast, have no protein or just carbohydrate, you've kind of missed an opportunity to get that synergistic effect. You're still, if you're healthy, training, you're still going to benefit from that exercise, but you're really not going to get the muscle growth or repair as effectively as someone who's got some protein on board. Does that make sense? So I think the initial strategy is to get a framework where there's some protein coming in throughout the day. Then it really doesn't matter so much when that your training session activity is. You're always going to benefit, have better muscle turnover, protein turnover, by evenly distributing the protein. Now, for athletes, this recommendation is really just a starting point. And for all research, it can't address everyone's unique circumstance. For athletes, when you're talking about when should I consume protein, when should I get the carbohydrates in, I think it really does have to be a practical approach. Fueling before a training event, a race, has to be performance driven. So you don't want to be taking in large amounts of protein before you're doing something particularly intense. All right, so the pre-training meal, exercise meal should be simple, geared for performance. Afterwards, I think that's the window for getting in the protein. It's a bit like the chocolate milk message. The timing for most of us doesn't really matter, but if you're going to be eating sometime after you train, it makes a lot of sense to get some high quality protein in fairly shortly thereafter. So we recently completed a study to look at this distribution theme. Very simple design. We took one group of volunteers and we put them on an evenly distributed protein diet. So they got essentially 30 grams at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The other group we put on the typical North American diet where breakfast was carbohydrate dominated and most of the protein came at the evening meal. And we measured muscle protein synthesis over a 24-hour period. So total protein, total energy was exactly the same. We just changed how the protein was distributed. And the results were really quite encouraging. We found that by simply distributing the protein evenly throughout the day, we had a 25% better muscle protein synthetic response. Now these results always look great in graph form, but we think if you were to take a 25% difference in these outcomes, over months, you're not going to see an actual change in muscle quality or mass or function. But when you look at changes over a lifespan from, say, 35, 40 years of age up to 70, sarcopenia is in the public eye a lot, and that's a very slow, progressive loss of muscle, 1% per year. It's insidious. a 25% difference over a day in building, repairing muscle could absolutely contribute to that really slow, insidious loss that we experience throughout our life. And by having something as simple as readjusting your diet to maybe slow that down, I think is a very sound strategy. And now, just going the other direction, one of the comments we get a lot is, is there any negative effect or consequence to taking in too much protein? Now, we can talk a little bit about the guidelines here. Now, the recommended dietary allowance, the RDA for protein, is a very valuable number for public policy and public health. When it comes to using the RDA for protein, 0.8 grams per kilogram, for an individual prescriptive use, particularly for athletes, it's really not that useful. So in terms of the guidelines, there's no tolerable upper intake level for protein, and that's from the Institute of Medicine and the Food Nutrition Board. They also go on to say that it's the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, lots of words, that you can consume protein that represents between 10% and 35% of your total energy requirements. And that's a massive range, up to 250 plus grams of protein per day. The caveat here is pop culture and a lot of advertisements and messaging is encouraging us to consume more and more. There's definitely a more is better environment out there. Now, protein has got some very well documented benefits, but like carbohydrate and fat, if you consume too much, you're going to put on weight. Now, people get confused with this 30 gram being the maximum amount, and you can't use more. Now, if you consume 50 grams of protein in a single meal, which isn't a massive meal, you're not going to waste it. Okay, the biggest consequence or risk is that those bigger meals are going to help you exceed your energy requirement, and that extra protein can eventually be turned into glucose and then fat. So you have to be very realistic with what are your energy demands and the demands of the sport. Taking in extra protein, it's going to have some benefits, but too much, you're going to turn it into fat. So we do need to be very careful. All right, so let's move on to an area that we hope we can all avoid, and that's being injured. Now, if we look at clinical populations, if you're admitted to hospital, if you know someone in a nursing home environment, most times when we're injured, we're physically inactive. In a hospital, I work in a clinical environment, we brag about our hospitals by the number of beds that we have. And for anyone who's ever been admitted to hospital, you know that for just about 90% of the time that you're in a hospital, you're physically inactive, lying in bed. Now this disuse, lack of movement, really does a number on muscle. In a clinical environment, we model this, and this was a study we did from NASA. Now NASA's interested in what happens when there's no gravity to load the muscle, but it's also a really good model of someone who's having to lie on the couch because they've torn a knee ligament, for example. Now in this study here, we took some really healthy young adults and we put them on bed rest for a month. A terrible thing to do to volunteers. Controlled their diets, they really didn't touch the floor. And we did a whole series of measurements. This is a DEXA scan, and DEXA measures essentially muscle mass. So we measured how much muscle they had lost just from the legs, from the waist down. And over this month of bed rest, these guys lost about a pound, half a kilogram, of lean mass from their legs. Now that's a reasonable amount of muscle to lose over a month. But barring a bad bike accident, you're probably not going to spend a prolonged period of time lying in bed. To make this a little bit more clinically relevant, we took a group of older adults, and these were really healthy older adults, so perhaps like an endurance community. We put them on bed rest for just 10 days. And that's similar to the typical length of stay if you get pneumonia or have other issues and are admitted to hospital. Again, same sort of diet, controlled it really well. When we were devising this study, we really weren't sure what to expect. We had to come up with a hypothesis. Would these older adults lose more muscle or less? And we took some cues from the athletic population. We know if you've got someone who's really well endurance trained or strength trained, and you stop their training, you detrain them, they lose their fitness, strength, endurance, whatever it is, initially at a much faster rate than someone who's sedentary. Now, they don't get to the same base level, but the initial rate of loss is much more rapid. So we thought that, gosh, maybe putting these older folks in bed rest, maybe the young guys are more habitually active, so they're more like the elite athletes, so putting them on bed rest, they would lose more muscle. So maybe these older folks really wouldn't lose too much muscle at all. We were wrong, and this is really quite frightening. In effectively 1/3 the amount of time that they were inactive, they lost 2 to 3 times as much muscle mass. And that's despite receiving more than the RDA for protein. So they got quite a lot of protein during this period. So that's about 2 pounds of muscle that these older folks were losing from their legs in just a little over a week. All right, now if you think you're avoiding this, in research, we tend to separate the age categories. We say young if you're between 18 and 40, we'll put you in that category. And then we start again when you hit 65 and older, we'll call you older. The middle-aged population is really an unexplored demographic. Now this again was a NASA-supported study where we took a group of 50-year-olds and we put them on bed rest for just 2 weeks. And honestly, we thought that they would experience physical decrement changes that fell somewhere in the middle between the young and the older adults. This was rather disheartening. And there's a lot of triathletes, endurance athletes who fit into this age demographic. As soon as we put these really healthy middle-aged adults who before bed rest looked just like their younger counterparts. They had the same muscle mass, their strength values were great. But as soon as we put them on bed rest, they lost muscle just as quickly as their parents or these older generation did. Now that's the problem, because a lot of these middle-aged athletes are out training. If we fall off a bike, we're injured, if we have to be laid up for a week or so, we can lose muscle mass extraordinarily quickly. Really problematic. So I think that talks a lot to strategies. The osteoporosis message, maintaining bone density, bone health, has really been ingrained in the younger adult population. We know we need to exercise, take in calcium, etc. I think with protecting muscle health, it can be the same message. Thinking about preserving muscle mass quality is not something that you decide to think about when you hit a Medicare mandated 65. You can be just as at risk at a much younger age, so it should be something that's in your consciousness earlier on. Get those good practices ingrained to protect you throughout the aging process. So we've highlighted a lot of the dangers of physical inactivity. What can we do? Now, anytime you're in a hospital setting, you've been injured, most experts are recommending movement. Don't just stay bedridden. And that's great advice. We've tended to focus on nutrition almost as the catch-all that's relevant for absolutely any population. So in our bed rest models, what we've done is try and look for something practical. Initially we used amino acids, one of those horrible amino acid cocktails that taste terrible. And we found that by just providing nutritional support during a catabolic period of bed rest, we're able to preserve muscle protein synthesis, muscle growth and repair, and that has a partial, I have to underline partial, positive effect on muscle mass and a lot of our functional outcomes. So we had a really nice proof of concept that nutrition during these periods of disuse, sedentary behavior, can have a benefit. What we've done more recently, and it's the research that we're exploring now, is to make it more practical. Now, a lot of you will have heard about the branched chain amino acid leucine. It's a really hot research topic. We're looking at leucine because it's not just one of the building blocks for protein, but it seems to act as a trigger or a switch which turns on the metabolic molecular processes within the muscle, and we think it allows the muscle to more efficiently grab the other amino acids that are coming in as part of a regular diet. And there's been some great research from colleagues where they've given a smaller amount of protein at a single meal, but topped it up with a little bit of leucine, and that amount of leucine has effectively made that smaller protein meal look like a larger protein meal. Now, most of the research now is still using just the isolated powder form of leucine, and the amount that we think you need is about 3 grams per meal. If you were to take in about 5 ounces of lean beef, for example, you could get 3 ounces in that. Dairy is also particularly high in leucine. Whey protein has probably got the highest, but you can get it in regular foods, so you really don't need to resort to this isolated, expensive powder. So we're doing a lot of research on leucine, but there's a couple of practical caveats that the research doesn't often address, but I think for athletes it's really important. So the research we do often has a clinical focus, looking at individuals who are really at risk of losing muscle mass. They're in a compromised situation, they might have an inflammation, injury, other things going on. It's a real issue for athletes to take this research from clinical populations and try and apply it to their own training. Now, leucine's a great example. So we've used it quite successfully in these aging clinical populations, and the mechanism makes a lot of sense for athletes. But it really goes back to that point I made before about, once you've turned on muscle protein synthesis, it's turned on. So adding extra to something that's maximally turned on doesn't give you a benefit. 30 grams of protein, good response. 90 grams of protein, same. So if you're an athlete, you're training, and you're consuming a solid diet, you're getting good quality protein in several times a day, adding something extra like leucine is not going to be a magic elixir where you suddenly improve recovery, muscle repair. Okay, so you've got to be worried, you have to be a little thoughtful with how you use some of this scientific advice. And for most of the population, we can get sufficient protein and leucine with our regular meals. When it comes to supplementation, it can be massively convenient, particularly for the breakfast meal. So you need to use the supplements quite judiciously. And another caveat, most of the people watching this are going to be training really hard. You have to be careful though. There's a lot of people out there who will go for a 2-mile walk or run and think they need to replenish, get the glycogen and the protein in. What we're seeing more and more often is that we're getting fatter as a society, and endurance athletes, triathletes are not immune from that. So most of us, unless we're training particularly hard, don't need a whole lot of additional supplementation. Start with the meals and be very cautious and judicious with how you use the supplements. So in terms of recommendations, the protein, 30 grams per meal, breakfast, lunch and dinner, that's a starting point. It's not a magic number, and you absolutely have to take that and adjust it, manipulate it depending on your own individual circumstance. So what are your body composition goals? What is your energy requirement, etc. And it doesn't have to be complicated. We can get it through a lot of different food sources, and a lot of our familiar foods are going to have lots of protein and leucine in them. So just to sum up, we can get really specific with the recommendations, timing of protein in regards to exercise, gram amounts of leucine and protein, but I think a general starting point is more appropriate for most of us. If we can establish a dietary framework that includes a moderate amount of high quality protein 3 times a day, that's a pretty good, robust framework. And then, as I mentioned, change it, manipulate it to accommodate your individual needs. Clearly, a 250-pound athlete is going to have different nutritional requirements, protein needs, to someone who weighs 100 pounds. But the concept remains the same, moderate amount at each meal. Now, the area that I think we can have some immediate short-term benefit is during these periods where we may be injured or not exercising. If we can react aggressively with nutritional support, supplemented with physical activity where appropriate, to try and slow down that really catastrophically fast loss of muscle that occurs in almost anyone, that can help us recover much faster and put us back on the training cycle more quickly. So one of the questions we get a lot is, should an athlete consume or try and consume protein during a long training session or perhaps even a race? And one of the difficulties is that there's not a lot of specific research really addressing that. So we're often left to try and extrapolate on the research that we did do, but also blend that with a little bit of common sense. So in terms of the research, if we think about what's happening inside the muscle when it's contracting hard, when you're exercising intensely, the muscle isn't interested in building and repairing. So muscle protein synthesis during intense contractions will actually turn off. It'll shut down. And it's going to stay turned off for about 30 or 40 minutes after you finish the exercise. So if you're consuming protein during a long training ride, for example, it's really not going to be that much of a benefit in terms of building and repairing muscle at that stage. Now, there is some research looking at the specific amino acids on cognitive function and fatigue and the like, but we won't necessarily go there. I think one of the bigger practical problems, though, if you're not used to consuming whole foods or protein during an athletic event, you really increase your risk of GI distress, which can have a massive detrimental effect on your performance. So for most individuals, primary recommendations, stick with what you're used to from training. Don't try anything new and unusual on training days. Protein during a long event, if you're doing something like an Ironman and your intensity is relatively low, you can consume almost anything you want. So the protein may be useful for satiety, but I don't think it's going to have any real positive effect on performance. For most of us, I'd say save it until you're finished.